Hey everybody, it's Kirsten. Today I'm going to bless you with my Acolyte level 1 to 50 build planner and build guide. We're going to go into great detail for every single skill point investment, as well as equipment and which prefixes and suffixes you want to focus on early on. Tons of tips and tricks for early on in the campaign. And we're going to try to make the guide as generic as possible so that it can apply to all three subclasses of Acolyte. So Necro, Lich, and Warlock. The primary reason I'm doing this is as prep for my Warlock season start coming up in a week or so. But given that Warlock is not out yet, I'm actually going to be running Lich for that prep. So I'll be releasing a Lich leveling showcase as well, going over the first 2 to 4 hours of the leveling process. So you can watch this video to learn all of the details of the skills and items, and then watch the actual playthrough to see what it looks like in practice. If you haven't seen it, I've already shared my Warlock season starter that I plan on using for Last Epoch's 1.0 launch. And I go into way more detail on the actual end game optimization for that build. Anyways, let's jump right in. Irashaimase! So let's start by talking about the skill progression from 1 to 50. And I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between all of these skills. So it's not going to be as clean as, okay, here's how you level Wandering Spirits, here's how you level Rip Blood, etc., etc. We have to talk about these as we level up rather than one skill at a time. And so early on in the game, you start with Rip Blood. That's your very first skill, and it's an absolutely horrible skill early on. It doesn't have any AoE. It has to be cast every single time to dish out its damage. The only upside is that it gives you some sustain because it gives you 10 HP on enemy hit. But luckily, once we hit level 4, we unlock the best leveling skill for Acolyte, and that is Wandering Spirits. It's great for leveling because you can cast it once and forget about it. And it's going to dish out damage for multiple screens after you've cast it, because the spirits continue spawning around you even after you've teleported away or you've walked away like 2, 3, 4 screens. So it is a great leveling strategy just because it's free damage. Wandering Spirits is unlocked at level 4, but also conveniently we unlock our first skill specialization on level 4 as well. So as soon as you hit level 4, you want to spec into Wandering Spirits, and this is the leveling recommendation that I will give you. First point goes into here, but more importantly, I love to beeline for Familiar Souls. A lot of other leveling guides will recommend for you to go down into the poison route. I don't believe that is nearly as good as going into Familiar Souls. What this skill node does is it reduces the reveal range for your spirits. And the spirits deal damage in a radius around them. And if 2 or 3 or let's say 5 spirits happen to be on top of a single enemy, all 5 of them will deal damage. So they definitely shotgun, and stacking them on top of each other is the best way to kill bosses. It is incredibly efficient. And so by reducing the reveal range for your spirits, all you have to do is stay near an enemy, and that will increase the chances that multiple spirits spawn on top of that enemy. It makes a huge difference for how many spirits get on top of the enemy. So that is what I recommend you invest your first 5 skill points into. The next 3 you put into cooldown reduction, and that is when we need to talk about the second skill that you want to specialize in. You unlock that at level 8. So Wandering Spirits might be 4 or 5 skill points, or maybe even 3 at that point in time. For your second skill, you want Rip Blood. And the reason for that is Arcane Absorption. Early on in the game, you're not going to have much spell damage from your weapons. Your wand might give you 3 spell damage. Your starting weapon gives you 2 spell damage. By getting up to 4 points in Arcane Absorption, that gives you 8 spell damage per cast for 6 seconds. So you can cast this a bunch and essentially snapshot the spell damage that your Wandering Spirits are going to have by casting this many times before casting Wandering Spirits. It's a huge damage boost. You want to utilize it as much as possible versus bosses. Versus non-bosses, you don't want to stop and cast Rip Blood. You just want to be casting spirits, and they'll kill trash as you're running around. And this is the combo we utilize for leveling. Rip Blood, Wandering Spirits. Once you've maxed out Arcane Absorption, you can get even more cast speed, so for more spell damage stacks. And afterwards, you can choose between extra cast speed or extra health gained from your blood orbs, depending on whether or not you need sustain. Certain builds will require more sustain, whereas other builds will require more cast speed. So make your decision based on what class you're running and what third skill you choose, for example, and continue on from there. Depending on how much int you've invested in as well, you can get even more health restoration per intelligence by investing in hematology. This is a solid investment given that we're already going to be stacking in our passive skill tree. If you find yourself running out of mana based on your third skill, you can invest in Mana Feast as well. Based on just these two skills, you will never run out of mana. So this is not really necessary. It's more for what you're going to be running outside of these two skills. And remember, we don't really rely on Rip Blood for dishing out damage. Rip Blood is just a utility skill for Wandering Spirits to deal their damage. It adds a little bit of extra damage, but it is not nearly as significant as the spirits themselves. And then around level 12 to 14 is when you're going to unlock your mastery. And you can choose between Necromancer, Lich, and Warlock. I will talk about what I would choose for leveling with Warlock versus what I would choose for leveling with Necro and Lich. So if you're running Warlock, and if you recall, this is the reason why I'm building this video, is because I'm going to be season starting Warlock, and it's going to be a Chthonic Fissure endgame build that I'm going to be working on. You can check out that video as well if you haven't. But because of that, we're obviously wanting to spec into Chthonic Fissure at some point. And then there's an interesting decision. You unlock Chthonic Fissure around level 12 or 14. However, you don't unlock your third specialization until level 20. So you have the choice of unspecking one of these two skills. I would strongly recommend for you to keep Rip Blood because the Rip Blood spell damage bonus applies to Chthonic Fissure's Torment as well. So that would mean, I guess, you would have to unspec Wandering Spirits. But Rip Blood Wandering Spirits is such a strong early game combination, and you've already invested a good amount of experience into Wandering Spirits. I actually recommend for you to wait until level 20 before specking Chthonic Fissure. It only should take around extra 20 to 25 minutes after you've unlocked Mastery. So it's not too bad, and as soon as you unlock it, it's going to catch up to these two skills as well. Not to mention that you don't really have a perfect third skill to spec into that early on. So these three will combine really well because Chthonic Fissure and Wandering Spirits are both great free damage. You just cast them once and you let them do their thing. Whereas Rip Blood is more of the active casting skill for utility, for upping your DPS versus single target enemies. And so the playstyle fits really well. These two skills, I think, can work together quite well, and you're going to be dishing out insane DPS. So let's say you've spec'd into Chthonic Fissure at level 20. You basically want to beeline into Twisted Waves, which is your primary damage multiplier early on by having high necrotic res. And our passive skill tree for Acolyte has so much necrotic res, you're going to be getting tons of damage from this node. So get 3 points in it right away. That's going to be around, I don't know, level 25 or so, maybe even earlier. Then get even more damage multiplication from your Crypt Multi, and continue to scale your DPS by investing in necrotic res shred stacks. So by skill points 10 out of 20, you're going to be dealing just silly amounts of AoE with Chthonic Fissure. Single target is not going to be as good as some other skills, let's say, but that's when you have Rip Blood to supplement your single target DPS. And of course, Wandering Spirits as well. So this is how I would approach the first 10 skill points into Chthonic Fissure. The next 5 are not as important. You can start speccing into Chaotic Rupture, or you can even get more DPS from Eradication. You have a little bit more flexibility there. It might be too early to spec into Chaotic Rupture at this point in time. So you can think about what works for you. And if you're playing Lich or Necro, your best option to specialize into at level 20 is going to be Spirit Plague. Spirit Plague can carry you through the entirety of monos and even into early empowered monos, and is probably the most efficient skill at killing large groups of enemies with minimal effort. The skill setup that I would recommend is 3-point in Pestilence. This bonus procs on Affliction, so it's very easy to get 13 stacks. After that, go for Plague Bearer. This is great early on in the game. Then beeline into Plague of Eyes, because we are stacking some intelligence. Necro might not have as much int, but it's still a decent option. Once you have Plague of Eyes, just go for more damage multipliers. Getting 1 point in Calamitous is decent as well, just to get extra spreads. And then you can even get some duration, some cast speed later on. Primary objective is just to increase its DPS as much as possible. And it wipes all trash mobs for free for you. A more defensive option is Summon Bone Golem. If you spec into Hunger and Blood Golem, You get a lot of survivability, but I think for efficiency purposes, Spirit Plague is better, and perhaps Bone Golem as a 4th skill is a reasonable option, because both of those are available to every single Acolyte subclass. So those are 2 really good options. Some people like Hungering Souls for single target, but this skill requires spamming, and so it kind of does not synergize with Rib Blood, so I don't recommend Hungering Souls. If you're playing Necro and you plan on running Flame Wraiths late game, you probably want to spec into Summon Wraith at level 20 and just start investing and leveling up your late game skill here. But now that we've covered what 2nd and 3rd skill we're going to spec into, let's go back into Wandering Spirits and discuss the next 5 points. From 8 to 13, you want to invest into Reap the Damned. This is one of the best more damage multipliers, because if you hit both conditions and you satisfy both conditions, these 60% more damage multipliers stack multiplicatively against each other. So it's 1.6 squared, which is 2.56. So it's 156 more damage for 5 points, which basically translates to 30% more damage per point invested into this skill node. So as long as you can satisfy the 2 conditions of cursing and damning the enemy, you absolutely want to invest into this skill node. Now let's talk about how we satisfy these 2 conditions. If you're playing Warlock, Chthonic Fissure, that's all. Chthonic Fissure applies Damned based on how we skill into it, if you recall. And it also applies a curse named Torment. By default, you don't even need to spec into that. So just with a few point investments, you can satisfy these 2 conditions and you can get so much more DPS out of your Wandering Spirits. If you're running Lich or Necro, however, the Warlock passive skill tree has this node right here, Chaos Flames, that gives you 6% damn chance with necrotic skills. So specking into this and converting Rib Blood into necrotic solves your damn problem. This is another option, damn chance on hit, and you don't even need to respec Rib Blood into necrotic. So those are your 2 options for getting enemies damned. In terms of getting enemies cursed, you can either spec into Bone Curse or spec into Spirit Plague. I would recommend getting Spirit Plague. Quite smooth, even if you don't spec into it. It's a decent option to have. It lasts for 3 seconds, while Bone Curse lasts for 8 seconds. So if you are lazy and you just want to cast it once and leave it, that's Bone Curse might be the better option. But if you don't mind recasting this every 3 seconds, Spirit Plague is a good option as well. For the last 3 points, it starts mattering less and less what you do. But if you're Warlock, you don't really care about Necrotic Res Shred because you already get it from Chthonic Fissure. If you're Lich or Necro, you definitely want to invest 2 points into here. If you're Warlock, just get more damage by going into extra Lingering Souls and then extra damage from Souls of Rage. In terms of Wandering Spirits usage as you're leveling up and as you're fighting bosses, it's important to note that the game does not spawn Wandering Spirits out of bounds. So if you're right next to a wall, you're essentially deleting half of the circle in which Wandering Spirits can spawn. So a really good strategy to taking down bosses is if you can get them in a corner and then cast Wandering Spirits there. That increases the probability that multiple Wandering Spirits will stack on top of the boss significantly. Best case scenario is if you're running across a bridge and you can get the enemies to go on top of that bridge. They just get deleted. It's absolutely glorious. So that's one tip that you want to utilize. Choke points are your friend. So now that we've covered the first 3 leveling skills, that is pretty much the most important thing you want to consider in your leveling build. You can't really easily rely on skills that you unlock at like level 35 or level 50. The first 35 levels are quite slow, and you want to make sure that you have a good strategy for those first 35 levels. Now, once you hit level 35, you will unlock a 4th skill specialization. For our late game Chthonic Fissure build, I recommend going into Ghostflame. And the way to level it is obviously you want to go and make sure that you can move while channeling as soon as possible. So we beeline into that. Then once you have that, you probably want to reduce the mana cost of channeling. So certainly 5 points into Spectral Menace to get that channel cost down, to make it more manageable. And then afterwards, you have some options. You can go into more move speed, or you can go into more survivability. Between these 2 nodes, great survivability there. You can see that I've opted for 2 points into move speed and then survivability, because at that point, you should have a decent amount of int. So this dodge rating will be significant. You want to take advantage of it as much as possible. Final 2 points, you start heading towards the damage reduction while channeling. But basically, as soon as you have the channeling cost under control, you can start thinking about ghost flaming around and enjoying that skating life. For the final skill specialization at level 20, you want to go into Chaos Bolts, and I only have 10 points invested in it. First, because you don't really need very many skill points for what we're trying to accomplish with Chaos Bolt. But second, it's because this is supposed to be a level 50 guide, and you unlock this at level 50, so you're not going to have very many skill points to work with. You can see we want to get to Rip Blood per Intelligence as early as possible, and then get into Bone Curse and Curse Duration Refresh, and finally get your Harvest per Dex as well as your Recast chance. Nothing too fancy there. And if you're running Necro or Lich, the last two skill specializations should really be a function of what build you're trying to head towards in the late game, or what skills you enjoy. And when it comes to the Chthonic Fissure Warlock build that we're trying to go for in late game, there's also the question of when do we respec Wandering Spirits into Bone Curse, which is what we have in our final build planner. You can do that pretty late. Bone Curse is not a very high value investment. So if you feel like your Chthonic Fissure has kicked in and the damage you're getting from that overshadows the damage from Wandering Spirits significantly, then you can get rid of Wandering Spirits and just get your Bone Curse and amp up your Chthonic Fissure damage even further. So I'm sorry if I went into great lengths around the leveling strategy for all 5 of those skills. I just felt like with a lot of the new players that we have coming in, but also myself having just learned all of this recently because I finally invested in learning early game for Last Epoch. There's lots of nuances that I thought I should cover. So I hope you found that useful, and I hope I wasn't rambling on in too much detail. Now, let's start talking about equipment. When it comes to level 50 equipment and below, obviously, weapons are pretty easy to talk about. You basically just want to grab the next wand or scepter that gives you good spell damage on the implicit. The implicit is more important than the modifiers. In terms of modifiers, if you're not running the Chthonic Fissure build that scales with crit multi, you just want to get increased dot, increased necrotic, increase spell damage, or increase cast speed. Those are the 4 good stats for prefixes. Suffixes, you don't really care. And remember, we're only getting crit multi for the Chthonic Fissure build because it's a more damage multiplier based on that 1 skill point. Early on in the game, you're never going to have max crit, so crit multi is a really bad affix outside of that 1 build. So weapons pretty easy. And in general, for a lot of your item slots, you want to focus on resistances. And just to get your resistances up and maxed out as early as possible. By level 50, you should have at least 3 to 4 resistance types maxed out with priority on physical res. And if you're running the Void timeline, you want to have Void maxed out. Or if you want to kill tier 1 Jorah, you want to have Void res, Cold res, and Lightning res maxed out. For the very first timeline, Necrotic res is really important, but that's going to get maxed out by default just because we're running Acolyte. And definitely, depending on the item slot, you want to prioritize resistances more so than other options frequently. So here's an example of a helmet that is kind of decent, and it has required level 29, +1 to Rip Blood, doesn't matter too much. It's more for the spell damage. So that's something that you want to utilize as well. Even if you have plus level to Marrow Shards, and you're not actually using Marrow Shards in your build, a tier 5 plus Marrow Shards is 41 to 60 spell damage. And that can benefit any spell build. You'll notice in all of these item slots, I have plus Necrotic res pretty much in a lot of them, but that's only because we're running Chthonic Fissure as a Warlock. If you're not benefiting from Necrotic resistances over 75, spec into other resistance types. Don't worry about the necrotic res. And yeah, other than that, you just want crit multi, damage over time, necrotic res, spell damage, and cast speed out of a lot of your affixes. Intelligence is decent. However, I don't recommend for you to spec into it too much early on in the game because it scales really poorly until you start getting to tier 4, tier 5. Going from tier 1 to tier 2 just gives you 1 int, and you also don't have much ward early on in the game. So I think intelligence is not something you want to stack too heavily early on in the game until you have some reliable source of ward. So you want to prioritize necrotic, dot, or spell damage, or resistances in the suffixes. For implicits, early implicits for Acolyte are not great. There's this one with the spell damage. That's probably the best one. A lot of the other ones are not great. Implicits on the amulet, cast speed is by far the best one until you can maybe get some resistances like the bone amulet one, but that is level 58 requirement. Brass amulet spawns very early on. Required level is 4. Get one with 10 to 15 cast speed as early as you can. Here's an example of a brass amulet, 3 stats, tier 5 necrotic, just as an example, but really that tier 5 necrotic can be tier 5 lightning res. For chest piece, the implicits again are not great for Acolyte. Cast speed is decent, but if you can get an extra 100 armor, that's a good option too. Burial plate It's probably one of the better ones, but it is level 57 requirements. So you're not going to have it by level 50. But as soon as you can get it at level 57, I do recommend using it just to make cold res maxing that much easier. For your belt, CDR and resistances is what you want to prioritize. Rings, same thing, get resistances and the usual damage options. You're never going to get as many damage options as I have across all of these items. So I'm just giving you examples of what is good for the build. For the implicits on rings, you want to get silver rings 100% of the time. So get your silver rings, apply runes of discovery on them just to see if you can get lucky and get good tier 1 modifiers. You can also gamble silver rings, but the 8% movement speed is so important early on in the game. You're running all the time to get through the campaign, to get through monoliths ASAP. Not to mention that the Warlock build that we're going for that benefits from necrotic res, we don't get ivory rings until level 66. So until ivory rings, and maybe even once you've unlocked ivory rings, you probably want to keep using silver rings until you've comfortably reached a point where your movement speed with Ghostflame and your mana sustain with Ghostflame has been taken care of. Outcast gloves are great for this particular Warlock build because of the necrotic resistance implicit. For boots, you prioritize movement speed as much as possible. If you get movement speed affixes or even boots that have, let's say, tier 3 MS and a bunch of awful prefixes and suffixes, you want to use a rune of shattering on them or even rune of removal to get as many MS prefix shards as possible, and then craft up your other boots to tier 5 MS. It's the same thing as the rings. You just want to max out your MS early on in the game and just zip through the campaign as fast as possible. Cooldown recovery is nice as well for certain builds to decrease your downtime on your mobility skills. In fact, I should take out cooldown recovery for this particular Warlock build because we do not benefit from it. Ghostflame has a 0.8 second cooldown, so cooldown recovery is not necessary. I'm just so used to getting cooldown recovery when I'm running Lich speedruns with Transplant, so I definitely need to take these out. So here's the augmented belt and adjusted boots as well. I replaced it with some resistances. For Relic, this is probably the best implicit that you can hope for early on in the game. Cursed Bones, because they give cursed damage for this Warlock build. If you're not running the Warlock build, there aren't too many good options. Defiled Bones are decent with a little bit of spell damage. You don't get the Decaying Homunculus until level 59. I don't have any idols and I don't have any blessings for this planner, just because you're not going to have any blessings just yet. But for idols, I would recommend hoping to get your resistances improved through your idols. If you have any that give you 2x1 or 1x2 that give you, let's say, plus 10 to plus 17 of a resistance type, make sure to use those. It's a great investment early on, especially if it has a vitality on the prefix. Those are best in slot for you. You don't necessarily want to worry about getting damage out of your idols, but the reality is you don't get very many idol drops in the first 50 levels. That whatever idols you do get, most of the time you just want to throw them on there. You start farming up idols once you get into monos and you start hitting up those idol monolith rewards. And finally, let's cover the passive skill tree. First 20 levels are fairly straightforward. Regardless of your class, you want to be investing into the int and necrotic res first, and then into the vit, and then into your ward and necrotic retention. This is even more important for Warlock just because of the necrotic resistance synergy with Chthonic Fissure. And if you're playing the Chthonic Fissure build, this is how you want to continue afterwards. 5 points into the mana sustain node right here. And then spell damage. You want to get this one as early as possible because, as I mentioned earlier, the weapons that we get early on in the game have very low implicit spell damage. So this will be a huge boost in your DPS coming from your Torment, which is a curse. Then we get some int, 3 points into Ward of Malevolence, which is not too useful early on because we don't channel Ghostflame at this point of the game just yet. However, we do have a good amount of necrotic res, so getting our ward decay threshold up I think will be beneficial early on in the game. It gives us vitality as well. Then we keep going. We eventually unlock Wither. Wither is an extremely strong node for this build because it's essentially going to triple your damage. As I mentioned in the full build guide video, a stack of Wither increases your curse damage by 10% and it can stack 20 times for 200% curse damage increase that the enemy takes total. And so this ailment, like I said, triples your damage. Make sure you get 5 points in here to take advantage of that triple damage. Then we get intelligence and vitality up at the top, followed up by just a few more points into damage reduction while channeling, because around this point in time, around level 50-ish, you should have your Ghostflame spec'd into enough to have the mana sustain more manageable, and so you should be more viable to be channeling more often than not. And this is where you probably expect to be around level 50 is 62 passive skill points, roughly, plus or minus 1, maybe plus or minus 2. But for the rest of your progression, I would recommend getting Duskbringer as soon as possible for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. Spell damage is just incredibly important early on in the game. And also your haste effect increase here is a good investment as well, early on in the game especially. So that is your passive skill tree progression and your itemization and your skill progression. This is kind of what the stats might look like around level 50. 50 intelligence because of a lot of the passive skill tree investments. Decent amount of health, and you probably want to have health here and there in some of your suffixes. Mana, this is incorrect here. It should be roughly 200 less, so 130. A little bit of crit multi to take advantage of the crit multi more damage multiplier. And we have 263 necrotic res. I think this is unrealistic. You're more likely to have 150 or so, but that is going to triple the damage of your Torment Curse. So keep that in mind. You want to max out as many res as possible. I usually get mine close to maxed out around level 60 to 65, 70. Critical damage mitigation is not something you can accomplish this early on in the game, but it is something you want to look into investing after you max out your resistances. So either through crit avoid or reduced bonus damage taken from crit strikes. Just remember that this bonus damage reduction from crit strikes is a less common affix than crit strike avoidance. So you could go for a strategy of crit avoid early on around level 60 to level 90, and then switching into crit damage reduction around level 90 plus, or you could just go straight into crit damage reduction. I do believe crit damage reduction is optimal for most builds, especially for Acolyte. Stacking armor is solid, and especially with this build where we can go for the armor while channeling Blessing. Armor is going to be a very strong defensive layer for the build. And if you happen to not be running Warlock, I would just take away some of the necrotic rest investment here and the crit multi investment in here and push it into something else, either cast speed or some other damage type for prefixes, and whatever resistances you need for suffixes or health. Thank you for making it to the end of this build guide for Warlock and Acolyte leveling from 1 to 50 for when Last Epoch finally goes live in about a week from now, and we start the brand new season from scratch. Get hyped, everybody, we're almost there. And if you haven't seen my video about which build I plan on running as Warlock in Last Epoch 1.0 season start, go ahead and check it out. I think I have a pretty good plan, and we're going to be ready to pivot anytime as well. And I'm also going to be dropping a full campaign clear so that you can see the process that I'm going to undertake to get from level 1 to 60, while at the same time clearing campaign and getting every single passive, every single item. I'm also going to be streaming my season journey on Twitch, so if you want to check it out, come and give me a follow, and feel free to ask me any question when you come by. Anyways, take it easy, and gochiso sama deshita.